So this morning I talked mainly about the Avery Menagerie, and this paper's really more about his museum and what has happened to it and the legacy it provides. Basically, it's the collection that I started working on in 1975, and as you'll see at the end of this, there are still things that I'm discovering in the collection which are of incredible importance. So I think we'll start with John James Audubon, who I've mentioned before. Going back to when Audubon came to Liverpool in 1826, desperate to find somebody to publish his Birds of America. He was a kind of backwoodsman, if you like, American backwoodsman, dressed in kind of moccasins and whatever, with long flowing hair. So I think people were a bit suspicious of him. But the Rathbones thought that his material was wonderful and somehow got word to the then Lord Stanley that this amazing bird artist was in town. And Lord Derby went to see him, not at the Rathbones' house, at a friend of theirs. And as you can see, he immediately thought the drawings were wonderful, and he had a lot to do with Audubon's amazing Birds of America being published. So Lord Derby, really, he was a very quiet man and very scholarly, but he did actually know everybody. He knew everybody in the kind of scientific world. He wrote huge numbers of letters to people in the business, and he corresponded with all sorts of people in India, in South America, in Australia. His letters, I think, rather than meeting people, the way he expanded his knowledge and in return helped people with their work on, particularly on birds. I think it was with the written word. You'll have seen the portrait if you were at lunch up there in the big ballroom there. You'll see the portraits, the two portraits that are there of the 13th on the left and the 12th on the right. 13th Earl of Derby was done in 1837, and he's holding a recently opened letter. Beside him has got the trappings of his greatest interests. So the roll is drawings. You can see it, actually, if you go really close to the portrait, which is halfway up the wall, so I wouldn't actually advise doing that today. The trappings of his greatest interests, drawings, natural history by Edward Lear is one of them, and the other one shows his other great interest, a plan of the diversion of roads in the township of Knowsley. And I love this one because it's like, oh, I'm just going to divert all these roads and whatever, and you just think, God, I wish he was here now to just sort out planning. But he diverted a load of roads. If you've seen Alan's plan this morning, the older map of Knowsley, you'll see before he drew the wall that some of the roads were in different places. So he diverted a lot of roads in order to make his 10-mile wall, and therefore to be able to have all the aviary and menagerie within the wall. As a young man, he was very active, riding to hounds here. Here you can see him riding to hounds with his son, Lord Stanley, who became the 14th Earl. This is in 1823. It's the Earl of Derby's staghounds, engraving by R. Woodman after James Barringer. I've put in that the huntsman's horses are called Spanker and Noodle, but sadly you can't actually see them because I've cut it off. They're over there. The 12th Earl, as Jenny was saying, and Alan, father of the 13th Earl, was a member of the rather racy Whig set. of the late 18th century, belonged to a lot of clubs, went racing all the time, did a lot of cockfighting. And I think because his mother had left her husband when he was only 4, the scandal and lifestyle may well have influenced him greatly. And he really was a quiet man who preferred to stay at Knowsley, write long lists of specimens, write labels for his specimens when his curators couldn't do so, wrote lots and lots of letters, and I had hundreds and hundreds of lists, most of which I have seen at one point or other. Species named after him, there are lots, and if you do look at A Passion for Natural History, there's a whole page of them in one of the chapters. When he was still Lord Stanley, before he became 13th Earl, he had the Stanley crane named after him, and that was named by Nicholas Figures, who was the Irish-born secretary of the Zoological Society of London. And Lord Derby had so much to do with the zoo. I think I've said before that he swapped lots of animals. He seemed to do very well out of the swaps a lot of times. But because he was the president of the zoo and he had his own aviary menagerie here, I think he was able to get away with quite a lot of animals that really had been at the zoo and were now up here. The Stanley crane, though, was actually in the Tower menagerie, which was in the Tower of London. It was quite a famous menagerie about which books have been written. And Lord Derby must have gone there because he said to Nicholas Figures, "I think that crane is new." Nicholas Figures went down to the tower and said, "Yes, it is." So he did a description of it. This is the picture of it at Knowsley done by Edward Lear that Jenny showed before. The one in the middle is Lord Derby's parakeet, an Indian bird, and we do have the specimen still. That was done from a skin. Oh, it was already a skin. It had never been alive. And actually, if you look at the skin, it's in exactly the same position. So it's obvious which one. These are all by Edward Lear, these pictures. Lord Derby's woolly opossum. This is from South America. This was named by George Waterhouse, who was the curator at the museum at the London Zoo. So again, you have the connection with the London Zoo. For years, we didn't really know what this was, because it looks like a kind of, I don't know, some sort of mouse, but it could also not be a mouse. Really didn't know what it was. And it was only when we got it out and then looked at this picture and realised the tail was still wrapped in exactly the same way and was still actually attached to a bit of branch that we realised it was the woolly opossum. It's actually a marsupial. So again, it was the one used to describe the species, and really important. It's just it had sat in the drawer without us realising what it was for 100 and something years. Many other species named after Edward Stanley, later 13th Earl. This is Lord Derby's eland, largest antelope, as I said before. The Stanley crane there on the left. And if you can just see in the cabinet to the right, there's some picture of hummingbirds. That's Lord Derby's hummingbird, of which we do have specimens as well. I'm still adding to the list of things, species that are named after the 13th Earl. There's many other insects and also quite a lot of botany. Insects include animals such as the African flower chafer beetle, Cetonia darbiana, and that was named by the Swiss businessman André Mallet. And some of you may remember George Mallet, the jazz musician, and André Mallet was an ancestor of his. So that's how they came to Liverpool. that Andre Melly came to Liverpool to work with Lord Derby. So that's why George Melly was here. However, those of you who have just bought A Passion for Natural History, if you turn to the page with Stanley's Whitmacanthus, you will see I have made a very big mistake. Not the only one in this book, I'm afraid. The flowering plant Stanley's Whitmacanthus, I'm not even going to go for how you pronounce that bit, Stanleyanum, is from Guyana in South America, was named in 1844 after Edward Geoffrey Stanley, later the 14th Earl of Derby, and not the 13th. It was only when I got this out to take a picture of it, I thought, that's not right. Lord Stanley was not Lord Stanley in 1844, and then realised it was the next one. So I'm sorry about that. If anyone wants me to correct it in writing, I will. I do have some acquaintance with the 14th Earl because he was rather begrudgingly issuing funds for one of the famous Australian explorer, Charles Sturt, who explored a lot of the interior of Australia. And Lord Stanley, at that point, this is before he became Prime Minister, was the Foreign Secretary and the one to issue funds to the very early Australian colonial administration. The specimen from which the picture has been taken is actually a Kew, and a lot of the 13th and other specimens from Knowsley, a lot of the type specimens of plants are at Kew, so they're not in our collection. We've got a few, but most of them are either in the British Museum Botany collection or at Kew. And the portrait of the 13th Earl there is taken from the Derby Cabinet of 1867 by Henry Gales, and it's at the National Portrait Gallery. It's a very small part of that picture. I've shown the passenger pigeon before. That's the one on the right, cut again, as I've said, from Audubon. And John Gould actually also cut up a lot of other pictures from his copy of the Birds of America. So that's the ivory-billed woodpecker, also extinct. So both these birds are extinct. And in both cases, Lord Derby had specimens that are still present. The ivory-billed woodpecker, we've got one in the collections here at World Museum. Unfortunately, we have got passenger pigeons, but none of Lord Derby's. But in my searches in other museums, which is what I've done all my working life, I found one in York Museum. So you never know what you're going to find. And that was actually once in the aviary here. So we did use that for the exhibition. We borrowed it. I've referred to type specimens before. So they are preserved individuals of plants or animals on which an author has based a description of a new species, genus, or other taxonomic name. They may be single or multiple specimens and are generally kept in museums or university collections. So it's a very kind of quick way of describing an incredibly complicated system, which has all sorts of sub-departments. And I have now discovered at my great age that I can only think about this for an hour before I have to go and have a cup of tea. It's so complicated sometimes. Just two examples here. This is the holotype, so it's the only specimen that was mentioned in the type description of the paradise parrot of Eastern Australia, sadly declared extinct about 5 years ago. They finally decided that it had gone. It's really important because it's extinct. It's really important because it's from an area of the kind of north of New South Wales, and southern Queensland, that they are really looking at trying to reconstitute very denuded countryside. And the Australians are very interested in where the rare species of birds used to be, in the hope that one day that they can go back to those areas. And you can see from the amount of labels on it, including the red one, which denotes it's a type specimen, how important this specimen is. It was so important that the labels actually pulled the tail off this bird, which is why it's got a dowling rod shoved off it now. And all the labels have been tied about 18 times. And it's got the accession number written on the dowling rod just in case that falls out with the labels. So we have to look after types in particular really well. And just to say, for years and years and years, I just assumed only skins could be types. And then somebody said, well, certainly eggs can be as well. And I said, well, how do you get DNA out of an egg? And they said, very carefully. So I think you would have to only get DNA out of the little layer between the shell and that skin that you take off after you've boiled your egg. And this is actually a type specimen of the little green goose collected by the person I work on, who's called John Gilbert, in 1844, again on the borders of New South Wales and Queensland. So again, really, really important. DNA, the discovery of DNA, has led to increased amounts of splitting species. So you've got a species, somebody comes along and goes, well, that one's different from that one. So, right, okay, that was a different species. And then you look at the DNA and they're right. So therefore you have to split it, which means if somebody has, so there's a type specimen for the original species, and then you have to declare a type specimen for the new species. Quite often, it already exists because somebody else has named that bird and they have been told that it's an invalid name. But if you split the species, then it becomes valid and that specimen becomes a type. So this is what I spend my life trying to sort out. This is a typical example. The bit on the right is from Wikipedia, which is now, to its great credit, actually listing type specimens and listing them with session numbers and where they are and everything. It's brilliant. So this is the kiwi, the southern brown kiwi, and this is the type specimen that is in World Museum. Emblem of New Zealand, as many of you will know. So it's the holotype of the southern brown kiwi, Atrix australis, named by George Shaw, collected at Dusky Sound, the South Island of New Zealand, by Captain Barclay, purchased by Lord Derby at the sale of George Shaw's collection in 1814. So it's very old. So if you look at the Wikipedia entry, it will say the southern brown kiwi is divided into two subspecies, with some conservationists arguing for a third. You start going, oh no, please. So Atrix australis, the Fiordland tokiata, with a population of approximately 15,000 birds found in Fiordland on the South Island. So that's ours. That belongs to the specimen on the left. A disjunct population near Haast is not to be confused with Atrix haasti, which is another species, is rare, with 350 specimens left, characterised by its rufous plumage. And actually, I know there is a paper coming out saying that that is a separate species. So it will probably be classified as Atrix australis something else. So it will be named as a new subspecies. And then somebody will decide it's a proper species, and somebody else will write another paper. So this is what we have to deal with all the time, is people coming to us and saying, you've got the type of this, we need to take some DNA off it, can we have a bit of it? So John Wilson, who replaced me at the museum, I know he gets these inquiries all the time. So it's what a lot of curators do. I mean, especially the insect curators get asked this all the time. So the 13th Earl's mainly known for gathering living and non-living zoological specimens, but he was also a very good scientist in his own right. So on the left here is his carefully written type description. So when you describe a bird, you have to write it down and then it gets published with a date. So he wrote this in 1814 when he was in his late 30s. And the subject was the black-winged lovebird, Psittacus taranter, which was collected by the artist and diplomat Henry Salt on one of his expeditions into the heart of Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. The Stanley denotes that Edward Stanley is officially recognised as the author of the new species. So he is the author of that species. You can see at the bottom bit, this is where I fall over. So the Stanley will be there forever because he described that species. Even if it gets split, his name is always associated with that scientific name. And you can see this is one of the entries. The entry at the bottom on the right is an entry from type specimens of birds in the Merseyside County Museum. My very first job at the museum was doing the index for this, which was horrendous. And you can see Lord Derby's parakeet by Edward Lear is on the front of that. So good scientist, author of new species, proper scientist. So what happened to the collection? So the 13th Earl had a stroke in the 1840s, and he began to think about where his museum should go because it became obvious that his son was just not interested in natural history. So at first he thought of bequeathing the collection of 30,000 birds and mammals to the then British Museum, but thankfully David Mitchell, who was the secretary of the Zoological Society of London by then, suggested he should leave it to the people of Liverpool. And Mitchell was supported by Lord Derby's daughter-in-law, Emma Smith Stanley, later Countess of Derby. And she was the daughter of Edward Booth Wilbraham, who I think was first Baron Skelmersdale. Is that right? So she was the wife of Edward Smith Stanley, who was the 14th Earl. So maybe that she realised her husband wasn't interested in natural history, and where was the best place for all these wonderful specimens, and why didn't the people of Liverpool have a proper museum? They did have a museum, but it was only open to people who were upper class. So you couldn't go in there if you were an ordinary person. So I think she really, and David Mitchell, were responsible for the fact that Liverpool is the way it is. I'll just come back to that bit later. The chap in the middle is Thomas More, I've referred to before. Lord Derby poached him from the London Zoo, where he was a manure collector. He brought him to Knowsley to be one of the animal keepers, which he was for many years. And then he became, when Louis Fraser, who had been Lord Derby's curator, decided to leave to travel, to collect and to describe new species, Thomas More took over from him. And then when the 13th Earl died in 1851, Thomas More came over to the people of Liverpool with the collections. And I said before, it makes me laugh because he actually was quite illiterate, and he then became the first director. So There we go. You don't need to be able to write to be able to know what you're doing. The Act of Parliament on the right was to set up a public museum in Liverpool based on the 13th Earl of Derby's museum. And at that time, it was about 30,000 specimens. So after his death in 1851, the collection, the Avery Menagerie, as I've said this morning, was sold individually, and the museum collection was crammed into the Union newsroom in Duke Street in central Liverpool in Chinatown. It's now the headquarters of Bibby, I think, and it was founded there along with the new public library in 1852. There were 30,000 birds, about 1,000 mammals, and was almost immediately added to by a collection of antiquities amassed by Joseph Mayer. The Mayer collection, again, is very important. It soon outgrew the Union newsroom, and in 1860, this is the Derby Museum by William Herdman in about 1870. It was built about 10 years before on what had been Shaw's Brow in central Liverpool, and on land and funding donated by wealthy merchant Sir William Brown. Well, he became Sir William Brown after that. The approach has changed significantly since the other buildings have been added to the right-hand side. As you know, Liverpool City Library is on the right now, Walker Art Gallery further up, and the new extension, which was built in 1898, is down to the left. And actually the bit that got bombed is this bit, or far-bombed, and the extension to the left, which now looks older, was the bit that wasn't bombed. So that's why it looks so different. So the collections were moved in here, and there were lots and lots of specimens on display, most of them Lord Derby's. A lot of them had been, cabinet skins were made to be in realistic positions. New specimens were added. So this is the British Bird Gallery. And lots of Lord Derby's specimens also have been given to other museums, as I've subsequently discovered. So I showed you the ocellated turkey, which is now in the Natural History Museum. And I was in the American Museum of Natural History in New York many years ago and opened a cabinet. And there were several rare parrots from the Lord Derby collection. And I was like, oh, what are these doing here? And Paul Sweet, who's the curator, got the accession register out, and apparently we'd swapped it for a dinosaur egg, which apparently we don't have anymore, so that was a bit sad. But at least we know what the specimens are. They are logged on MIMSI, our central database session. Having been in Lord Derby's collection, they're still in Lord Derby's collection, but they are now in New York. We still have, at the last count, 16,735 specimens, whoever was asking this morning, in the Lord Derby collection. So most of them have survived. The collection is of great importance, as I said. Many scientific papers have been written about the collection. John Wilson, who was my successor, has recently written a paper on the white eyes that have been missing since the war, so that's just been published. A paper has just been published on the earliest night parrot of Australia, which is the world's rarest parrot, was thought to be extinct until recently. And then some colleagues of mine were out in a van in Northern Territory, and they hit a bird, and it turned out to be one of these parrots. So apparently it's not extinct. Unless that was the last one, as you say. So they had to extract it from the grill at the front. And it's in so many bits. Most of it's in Queensland Museum, but given the importance of the specimen, we've actually got a clump of feathers in this collection here. So it has to have the accession number from the Queensland Museum on it. So everyone's like, well, how can we put that on our database? So anyway, so these are a paper on Henry Salt's collection, most of which was described to science by the 13th Earl of Derby. There's a catalogue of the mammal specimens from the collection of the Earl of Derby, which I wrote with Malcolm many years ago. Bird specimens purchased by Lord Stanley, when he was still Lord Stanley, at the sale of the Leverian Museum in 1806. Incredibly important collection, still being looked at, and I will come back to that in a minute. Other important specimens, this is our only Charles Darwin specimen that we know of, that we've found so far. Charles Darwin's writing from Woolsey Straits, from the Magellan Straits. Female, Irides brown, so that's the eye colour. Shellfish, he means that's what it was eating. V common, and it actually is on a quite common oven bird, but the oven bird not being terribly uncommon is very important because it's a Charles Darwin specimen. We have Audubon specimens. He sent a lot to Lord Derby. They corresponded a lot over the years. This is Greenbank House, where he stayed when he was in Liverpool, at the home of the Rathbones. It's now part of Liverpool University. This is a Lewis's woodpecker from USA and Canada, collected by Audubon himself with Audubon's label, acquired by Lord Derby in 1837. And this is where, when Audubon came and met Lord Derby, that's where he went down on his hands and knees to look at Audubon's artwork. And they were friends and correspondents for over 20 years, and they both died in 1851. Probably the most important specimen, I think, in Lord Derby's collection is the spotted green or Liverpool pigeon. We try not to call it the Liverpool pigeon because it's actually not from Liverpool, and people think it's from Liverpool. It was named in 1789, but it was actually described before that. So it's described as Caloenus maculata. The British ornithologist John Latham had actually called it the spotted green pigeon about 20 years before that. So it's a very, very old specimen. And it is so old, actually, one of its legs has since dropped off. So it now lives in a little tray with its legs sitting there as well. This is the problem with things dropping off. As you can see, it's got a red label, and it's the type of the species, and actually it's the only one known. Everyone kept saying, oh, it's one of these, or it's one of these, and whatever. And we had its DNA done, and it's not related to anything. So it's on its own. And it's the original picture by John Latham is the one on the right. So that was done in 1822, shortly after it had been described. He actually did a picture of it. And the one on the left is by the Dutch artist Joseph Schmidt, done in 1898. And we're always very confused by this because it's got a knob on its beak, and it certainly doesn't now. So did it drop off or what? So given the scientific name, 1789, acquired by Lord Derby from Major Thomas Davis, and we think it's probably from Tahiti because they refer to a spotted green pigeon in the very early days when sailors visited Tahiti. So maybe it's from there, but it certainly doesn't exist there anymore. It's very distantly related, according to the DNA, to the Nicobar pigeon, which is a pigeon with an incredible top knot, but it is very shiny like this. And those two birds, the Nicobar pigeon and the spotted green pigeon, are the closest relatives that have been found to the dodo and the solitaire, which of course are both extinct. So some people have kind of got the wrong end of the stick with the Liverpool pigeon. So when we did an exhibition in 2011 called The Ghosts of Gone Birds, which was pictures of extinct birds, Ralph Steadman did the one on the left. So we said, can you do a picture of the Liverpool pigeon? So he did a picture of a Liverpool pigeon, not ours. And it's talking to the liver birds about where Ralph Steadman comes back. But I just think it's such an hilarious picture. The one on the right is called The Tragic Demise of the White Gallinule by somebody called Le Gun, both done for the exhibition, as I've said. So the white gallinule is this one. So our specimen's the one on the right. It's the holotype of the white swamp hen Porphyrio stanleyi, who was named after Lord Stanley again, and it comes from Lord Howe Island. It was purchased by Lord Derby from the sale of William Bullock's museum for 3 guineas in 1819. William Bullock's museum was originally in Liverpool, and it was one of these, museums where you paid a guinea to, not a guinea, a shilling to go in and look around. It was a public museum, but it had some incredibly important specimens, and Lord Derby did buy a lot of them. So it was originally a specimen belonging to Joseph Banks, who was the scientist who went with Captain Cook's first expedition and then had a row with him and didn't go on the expedition 2 or 3. Very important, thought to be for many years the only one. And then we found that there was one in Vienna. So that's the one on the left. That's it. There's just these 2 specimens. The one on the left is actually called Porphyrio albus. It's got another name, named in 1790, from a description by the surgeon John White, who was with the First Fleet, that went out to Australia. And this, as I said, is in Vienna, probably the same species, in which case Porphyrio albus becomes a synonym until they decide, again, it's 2 species. And it probably became extinct because of being killed for food by visiting sailors before Lord Howe Island was actually settled in 1834. It was already gone. So 2 specimens, and that's it. We have the really, really famous, the only Madagascan starling ever described. Then we realised it was a West Indian mockingbird. I just put this in because it just cracks me up. What happened was there was a parcel of birds sent in a kind of turn of the century to the museum from West Indies that was labelled from Madagascar. So all the birds in that parcel were labelled as from Madagascar and given very, very strange names because nobody could understand what they were. So we had to go right back to that day, look at the accession register, get all the birds out and relabel them. So basically being a curator is just, it's like having a jigsaw puzzle with 2 bits of jigsaw, none of which are from the outside. So, you have to go right back to the beginning and find out little clues to what really was going on. So basically, this isn't really an extinct Madagascan starling at all. It's just quite a common mockingbird from the West Indies. I think one of the problems was it's, albino, so everyone had missed what it really was. Other important specimens, John Wilson's been working on the Sir Stanford Raffles collection. Again, this is to demonstrate just how important it is not to believe anything you ever read, because everything you ever read says that all the Raffles collection are in the Natural History Museum and came either via the East India Company Museum or the Zoological Society of London Museum. But actually, you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 at least specimens from the Raffles collection, and the pages from the 13th Earl of Derby's his own catalogues that he wrote. And you can see on the right it says, given to me by Sir Stanford Raffles. So actually they were donated. And there's more than 10. It's just John has only found 10. Perhaps the others have, gone. There were 21 of the Sumatran birds were given to Lord Stanley, and those are the ones that John has found. So being a detective, he's gone through the whole collection, looked at that list, gone through the collection and found what he can. This is my own research on John Gilbert's collections from Australia, 1838 to 1845. These are the very first specimens ever collected in what's now Queensland, and they were collected even before it was called Queensland, so they are very old. The two little birds facing each other in the middle at the bottom are subsequently discovered to be type specimens, so they're part of a series that were named from those specimens. And so it's a new species called the white-browed robin, Poecilodryas superciliosus, collected on the Burdekin River in 1844. And actually that was on an expedition where Gilbert got killed. So somehow these specimens were carried to safety by one of the first peoples who was with them. So the leader of the expedition, who was called Ludwig Leichhardt, tried to throw everything away. And it was only that the first people's assistant, who's called Charlie, hid them in his saddlebag that they still exist. So it is rather a miracle. And just to say, the white-browed robin, again, about being a detective, when John Gould, who was Gilbert's employer, described the species, he had something like 7 specimens in front of him. So they're all in the type series. They all belong to that species. They're the standards for that species. So far, I've found them in Liverpool, Philadelphia, Exeter, Melbourne, Leiden, which is in the Netherlands, and the American Museum of Natural History. So John Gould described the new species, sold them to all sorts of people, and now all my job is to try and resurrect them, resurrect the series. Other specimens, other collections we've had since, because Lord Derby's collection was so important, Liverpool then became really important for bird collections, and we were able to buy Canon H.B. Tristram's collection in 1896. Amazing collection worldwide, really, really strong in Tristram's own specimens from the Middle East. You can see him there on the left, ready to go out and shoot everything in sight. In the middle, he's slightly older and more staid, perhaps. And then the book about him on the right from William Hale's biography of Canon Tristram. Very important collector and scientist himself. And that collection is proving its worth. It's very important. One of the most important specimens is the New Caledonian goatsucker. Again, you can see from the red label and the word type written in large letters that that is the type of the species. It's the standard for that species. We thought it was the only one. And then about 20 years ago, my colleague Collo Violani, who's an Italian curator, found one in the back of a cupboard in Rome. So there are 2, but it is extinct. So no longer there. Just a quick talk about A couple of slides about the collections now. So they're all stored at the moment in the basement of World Museum, in the newer extension, the one that didn't get bombed. So we've got a wet collection, that's the collection on the left. I think that's a load of fish stored with their heads down in very, very tall jars. The skin collection in the middle, we keep things in metal now, not in wood. Wood tends to take the bloom off plumage. So usually bird collections and mammal collections now are stored in metal, not in wood. Obviously, in the old days, it was always wood, so I think that's why some of them have faded slightly. There is a very big mounted collection as well. The one on the right is the Falkland Island collection, which now a lot of those species don't exist on the Falkland Islands anymore, so that's quite important. Just to say, they don't just sit there. This is the type of the nene, so it's the standard of the species. Nene named for Lord Derby. This was once in the collections here. And as you can see, what happens if you're a duck or a goose, you've got lots of grease inside you, and the labels that were tied onto the legs here have just got soaked in oily duck, basically, oily goose. And they've basically fallen off and broken. So they need degreasing, they need mending, and they need, the whole bird needs to be degreased. So how do you get, how does that happen? How do you get any of the enough money to go through such a huge collection and improve the situation? It's always a complete battle. And just to say, Lord Derby's archive is huge. It's kept also with the bird collection down in World Museum. It's in the Vertebrate Zoology Library. This little row of red books, red files, contains all the tiny scraps, copies of all the tiny scraps of paper that Lord Derby wrote little notes on. These are all in Liverpool City Library now. So we've copied them and tried to get them in some sort of order and to make notes on what they might refer to. So it's always a very ongoing situation. Quick numbers here of what we've got now. Mimsy is our database system at National Museums Liverpool, so all the specimens are on this system. 68, nearly 69,000 bird specimens. Says 6 eggs, that's actually thousands, but we haven't got them on Mimsy yet. It's such a big task. Nearly 15,000 mammals. So a lot of all of these have been in the Lord Derby collection. Just over 2,000 reptiles, nearly 1,000 amphibians, mostly type specimens collected by my previous boss, Malcolm Largent, who's sadly not with us anymore. And the fish, piscays, again, nearly 2,000. So there's a lot of specimens to look after. And where they're from, probably the most important regions we've got, and again, that goes back to the Lord Derby collection and what he collected, what he was keen on and what he thought was important, was Australia, India and South America. India and South America is certainly the places he corresponded with a lot. And he obviously sent out people to collect. So he had a collector, 3 collectors in Australia and several that went out to South America. So the amount of money he spent is incredible. And just to finish, every time I go in to the museum, which I don't do as much as I should anymore, I find something new. So I got this sooty petrel out, bulbous petrel, because I thought it might be Australian. And then I noticed this label, and then I noticed whose handwriting it was, and then I noticed it was incredibly important. And I'm not going to tell you anything else because I'm writing a paper about this with my supervisor, Alex Bond, who's the head of birds at the Natural History Museum. And when I showed him this, I waited till he actually was in Liverpool with me, and I showed him this, and he said, "Such a rude word, I will not say what it was." But we are writing, this is an incredibly important specimen. The only reason we know that is from this label. There's nothing else on the bird. So next time you hear me talk, I might actually admit what it is. So anyway, thank you, and thanks for listening.